Thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah. Dominic, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. I heard many great stories, and I cannot wait to go back to the field and write some of them. Timothy, who was here in this armchair before me, you're the first story I want to write about. You sold it. So I came to Donbas in April after covering for weeks, months, Maidan, having long sit-down interviews with Tymoshenko, Poroshenko, Yarosh, trying to really understand the story on that side. It was difficult to be a tabula rasa, completely forget about Maidan coming to Donbas. But I tried to do it. I came to a hotel full of foreign Western reporters. I was the only Russian covering the conflict at the time. There were more Russians coming later, but that day, it was April 15th. I remember it really well. It was a really beautiful spring day in Donbas, in Donetsk. Donetsk is a really nice city, used to be. So there were first flowers coming out, and I walked along Pushkin Boulevard, from one bank of that boulevard to the other, talking to people at a barber store, at a grocery store, at school number 1. And they unloaded, as they heard Russian language, Moscow accent, as they say. I speak, apparently, with Moscow accent, although originally I'm from Nizhny Novgorod and St. Petersburg. Somehow I developed Moscow accent. And it's recognized all across Ukraine, including Donbas. So people would unload their emotions on me and tell me how offended they were by Kiev. About 50%, I would say, of people wanted to live in Russian Donbas or Russian-controlled Donbas, and the rest wanted to stay in Ukraine. But those offended people told me that they were afraid of being separated from Russia, as their relatives were in Russia. They were working for factories that sold their goods to Russia. They were losing their lives. They had that feeling. They had no clue what Maidan was about. They did not know even simple things about European values. What they care about is not losing their lives. And then I turned the corner, and there was the first sign I saw on the barricade that said, "USA, go home." So that's my first day in Donbas, April 15th. That was the third narrative. So here I was, a Russian-American reporter, covering Ukraine, and having these 3 stories to tell. Basically, wherever I went from that point, I heard sometimes completely different stories about the same thing. And how do you report on the conflict under huge pressure of propaganda from both sides? It was probably the end of April when one of the friends sent me an email saying that you're on the list of the 5th column in Russia. 5th column is if somebody does know, it is a list of enemies of Russia. So I was doomed to be deported from Russia and deprived of my Russian citizenship by somebody sitting, I think, in Paris, actually, the author of the website, Russophobe website. But I think people opened up to me in Donbas sometimes more than to foreign reporters because of my Russian, and revealed some details to me that they wouldn't have probably told me about if I were a Western person, right? So once in Horlovka, on the day when it was taken by rebels, the OGA building was taken by rebels, I managed to interview the commander inside the building. We had a long interview. And his name was Anatoly. He came from Slavyansk. And he was telling me about this professional Russian military who came to help them out in Slavyansk to clean it up. So that was the first time I found evidence of professional Russian military being on Ukrainian soil, helping out in cleanup operations. Once again, if I were not Russian, I don't know if he would have told me that story, right? In a different episode, I was crossing on the day or the next day after the airplane crash. I crossed from Russia to Donbas from Rostov region, and SBU questioned me for 2 hours because of my Russian citizenship and because of my Russian accent. They didn't trust my story. It took them 2 hours to figure out who I was and what sort of stories I report. And then 2 days later, I was arrested by Donetsk rebels, together with the Time reporter Simon Schuster and my good friend, Italian reporter Lucia Sguella. We were taken to Strelkov's prison, which is a big military base headquarters for former Sloviansk guys in Donetsk. And that's where, that was a mind-opening experience, because I had a chance to meet with the same Slaviansk guys I had interviewed in Slaviansk during their fighting there. If somebody does know, so Slaviansk was kept by Strelkov for a while, and then they were kicked out of Slaviansk, moved their forces to Donetsk, and the prison of SBU was their base. So all three of us were inside the prison, and we spoke with the commander who was in charge for, I guess he was responsible to decide what to do with these reporters, keep them in the basement for a month or let them go. He didn't like Simon because Simon, all Simon has on him was American passport. And he didn't like my accreditation because it said USA on it. So he shamed me. He said, how could you, a Russian, be in the same car with an American while American bombs fall on our houses? It was an American bomb that destroyed my house, he told me. So that is one story. I come from Moscow, where even today, 70% of people don't believe that Russia is at war with Ukraine. While in Ukraine, 74% of Ukrainians say we're at war with Russia. Two completely different narratives. And besides, another thing that is really a problem and challenging, people often make up stories. They create myths, right? So a day after M17 crash, locals told us that the bodies had no blood on them, the passengers. So they must have been dead long before, and somebody put them on the plane when they were already dead. Why were they naked? Of course, they were traumatized because there was a rain of bodies from the sky. And that's a very emotional and emotionally challenging part of our job, because you speak with people who often cry on you. For instance, I was in an orphanage in Teres, and the teacher of the orphanage told me about these two bodies that flew from the sky, and they landed right in the garden of that orphanage. She took me inside, and children told me about these big birds that were flying to them. And after this very emotional interview with kids and with the director of this orphanage, I go outside, she takes me to the gate, and then she hugs me and she cries on me. She says, I'm the only one who wants to live in Ukraine, here in this orphanage. So I'm totally isolated. Another myth that people lived with was, or fear, let's call it this way, it's a little bit more polite, that was shale gas. And I did a big project for Al Jazeera, trying to, together with Stanley Green, it's a very famous photographer. We traveled along gas pipes, and we traveled to Sloviansk, to this shale gas field, and talked to people about when it all started. They couldn't remember. They said probably in winter we were coming out to protest and put out the sign on the Lenin statue that said, "Shell, take your hands off our shale." But it was difficult for them to really remember. So what was the reason of this whole conflict? That was back in February when we protested against the shale gas production. I also need to tell you that unlike the other conflicts that I covered Chechen War, Georgian War, some Middle East, and Central Asia, we were struck how accessible the leaders were in LNR and DNR. They were very transparent. Baradai came to the hotel to talk to us on the veranda, except for Strelkov. Strelkov didn't talk to us, but you could talk to his commanders in his prison. They wanted to talk because they really believed they had a very good course. They were heroes, and they still tell us that. Heroes who defend Europe from international fascism. Not just Ukrainian fascism, but the world has this threat. Europe is under threat of international fascism. We were not, our fathers and grandfathers were not appreciated enough for helping the world to get rid of fascists during the Second World War, and we are not appreciated now, but it's okay. We can die as heroes defending Europe from fascism. So that's the rhetoric we hear. I'll read a little bit, just one paragraph. Yeah, 2 minutes. In July, from my political piece. In July, Donetsk was heavily shelled. My colleagues and I discovered a dead woman, 2 dead men, and destroyed cars and buildings in the middle of Donetsk, along Slovatskaya Street, in the area between Donetsk railway and bus stations. The woman on the ground could be my age, though it was hard to say. She was lying on her stomach. The shell had hit her head. It was missing. Her 2 black shoes, ripped off her feet by the explosion, landed next to each other by her head, as if they had continued to look for a shelter. In that shelter, once again, in the basement of a school, I heard 2 narratives. Some women were screaming at my friends, Italian reporters, for coming to tell lies about their trouble. And another family was yelling at me for my Putin, who is sending troops to Ukraine, to Donbas. So basically covering this conflict, what we had to do, we had to bounce between Kiev, Moscow, Donbas, talking to main characters in these 3 regions. Motiyenko, the head of Federation Council, recently found the scapegoat and called us the guilty ones, us reporters who work for American media. We are guilty in this conflict because we are American propaganda paid by America. So anyway, to conclude, I would like to say that the only way to stay sane, not go nuts, covering this conflict, I would say to stick to basic rules of old school of journalism and just answer questions: what, who, when, and try to help you guys analyze it and write your papers. But to be on the ground is the main thing. If I were not in Luhansk on the square on the day when the plane went down and shelled the square, if I didn't count the craters, I wouldn't have known that. If I didn't meet the CNN military advisor who told me that it was what it was, I wouldn't have known that it was American jet shelling Ukrainian Luhansk square, right? If I were not in Odessa on the ground a couple of weeks ago, I would have never seen a big billboard of a woman, a Chechen woman, in a hijab with a gun who ran for parliament. And she was a Chechen, a surgeon who wanted to be a politician, but she didn't win, so she went back to the front, and she's calling Chechens from Austria and from Denmark to come and fight Chechens who come from Russia. So that's her personal jihad, she says, and that's a completely different story.